James Stavridis joins me. He is, of course, United States Navy retired, former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, former head of Southern Command. Good morning, Admiral. How are you?
Doing well, Hugh. How are you?
I'm great. I want to go far afield from our national security discussion today to more of a wider lens. You're a Navy man, and therefore you have an institutional attachment to the Navy, right?
I do.
Would you explain what an institutional attachment is? Because I want to contrast it with the transactional attachment that maybe some people on Team Trump are disappointed with the Supreme Court's decision yesterday not to hear the Pennsylvania case. But I predicted it in December to them, telling them that it was not in the Supreme Court's institutional interest to take that case. But if we start with the Navy's institutional interest, we can work out from there.
Institutional interest, I would argue, is something that is in your bones. It starts very early for you, typically. So in the case of the Navy, that means maybe you grew up in a family that has someone who's in the Navy. Maybe you live near the sea. Maybe you have seen a show or read a book that has a big impact on you. When I was a boy, kind of all those factors came together. Lived in Florida, watched Jacques Cousteau, had a dad who was in the U.S. Marine Corps, the sister service to the Navy. Institutional affection and affiliation then continues in your education when you take that big step of picking where you go to school and what you learn about and what you read. For me, U.S. Naval Academy. It then continues as your professional life unfolds, and you learn more and more about that institution as you go along. And some of what you learn is from books. You read history, you read about the great figures in the Navy, and some of it comes from your own personal experiences at sea. And so by the time you're 35, 40 years old, you are really grounded in the institution, whatever it happens to be. For me, it happens to be the U.S. Navy. I'm pretty happy with my choice of institutions.
And correct me if I'm wrong, when you are a plebe, I believe that you often have to stand ready to address upperclassmen on matters of trivia having to do with your institution, correct?
Absolutely. Part of it is that you are constantly tested and challenged, and you memorize passages about John Paul Jones. You memorize naval quotes from Admiral Dewey at Manila Bay, excuse me. You memorize quotes from Admiral Farragut at Mobile Bay. You learn about the great figures. You learn their words. They become part of you. That's an institution finding its way into your DNA.
Now, Washington, D.C. is full of institutions. There's the House of Representatives, there's the Senate, there's the Department of State, there's the Pentagon, which is a collection of institutional interest, and then there is the Supreme Court. Do you want to reflect a little bit? You've moved around in this water for a long time. How different institutional interests will collide either within the Pentagon or within the Beltway?
Sure. The most obvious example inside the Pentagon is going to be the competition between the services for budget, for money, for resources. So we're at a period right now where the U.S. Army has rightfully received a great deal of resources because our forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were largely land-centric. As we prepare now for great power competition, particularly with China, you're going to see the Navy and the Air Force and the Space Force achieve a larger share of the budget. That won't come without a collision between these institutions. And I assure you, those O5s, those lieutenant colonels and commanders in the Navy who do battle in the briefing rooms every day in the Pentagon, going up to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and laying out the case for resources for their institution, the DNA of that institution is a huge part of what drives them forward as they put these presentations together. And let me close by saying all of them will try and rise above individual institutional interests and try and address the national interest. But I assure you, when you put on that Navy uniform and you go in there to brief the Secretary of Defense and you lay out the case for bringing more ships into the Navy because of China as a great power competitor, you're hearing echoes in the background of John Paul Jones and Stephen Decatur and Dewey and Farragut and Nimitz and all who have gone before you as part of that institution.
Now, eventually, you do get to a level in the executive branch, where the institution is actually Article 2. So General Austin, though he might be an Army guy, is now wearing the DOD and the executive branch institution, and they run into the Supreme Court, which is a long way of my getting to why did the Supreme Court not hear the case yesterday having to do with the Pennsylvania election. And I predicted it because, and I told senior people in the White House, it's not in their institutional interest to get involved. Meaning, they didn't want to do Bush v. Gore 20 years ago. They wanted nothing. They punted once. It only came back to them because these institutions don't want to go on car crashes, right? They don't. The Navy doesn't walk into budget fights between the Army and the Air Force. There's no upside for them, right?
Absolutely. And let's face it, another way to put this is institutions are like people. They have self-interests that are both short-term and long-term. Sometimes those two things come into contradiction, but as a general proposition, they align pretty well in my experience, at least in the case of the institution I'm most deeply familiar with, the United States Navy. These institutions have long-range goals they want to achieve. They have short-range priorities. They're going to use their ethos and their history. They're going to put themselves in a national context as they try and describe what it is they want to bring to the table. And by the way, all of them, Army, Navy, Supreme Court, the Congress, all of them are going to do their very best to put it in a national context and say that what is best for the Navy is best for the long-range interest of the Navy. Probably that's where the Supreme Court has landed in so many ways.
And the final iteration of this conversation, yesterday Facebook folded in Australia. Australia wanted to pass a law that would charge Facebook for using links to Australian media. Facebook originally withdrew from Australia. Yesterday folded up. Said, okay, we'll do a deal. The Facebook is only 20 years old. It doesn't have any institutional memory. Legacy media is 150 years old. They've been fighting for, and they've got ties with Australian legislators that go back, 100 years. They've been various press barons. Do you think high tech has any idea how to navigate the institutional interests of various bureaucracies, interest groups, and executive branch agencies in all of these countries around the world?
I do not, and you put your finger on why that is. These are brand new institutions. Someday a sociologist will study this phenomena in some depth. And I think this early stage learning of institutions will be a fascinating chapter in the book. And of course, all of the tech companies are different. They have different initial founders with different personalities, with different goals. So I think it's hard to lump them together. But I think to your theory of the morning, that institutions develop self-interest over time, we're going to see the tech companies do so, work together to do so. I think that phase of their life cycle is coming, but they're so young in the context of, say, a U.S. Navy, which is well over 2 centuries old.
Yeah, they're adolescents. And I try and explain to people they're going to make adolescent mistakes in rapid judgments. It's why you don't let lieutenants run carriers, right? You've got to learn, but a lot of the Silicon Valley people are quite young and they're going to make young mistakes, but they've got to eventually adjust to the fact that these institutions, every institution, Wall Street, the court, the Navy, Australia, they're all going to look at them differently. And I don't know if that self-awareness has dawned yet.
I don't think it really does for a pretty distinct period of time. Let's take it to a different place, which is institutions of higher education. Let's look at universities in the country, which are now also, like the Navy, about 200 years old, many of them. And it's taken a long time for Harvard and Princeton and Yale and even newer ones, the University of California system, which is the envy of the public system in many ways. It takes a long time for these institutions to develop their self-identity, find their voice, find leaders that are iconic along the journey of their development. And tech companies haven't done that. The military services, these institutions of higher education, the Supreme Court, I think, are examples of institutions that have done so.
Last question on this, and then I want to ask you about 2034, which is behind you, Admiral. I've often argued the best pundits, the very best pundits, are those who can summarize fairly and accurately the most persuasive arguments of the other side to which they are opposed. That's a legal training. I am curious if the best proponents for an institutional point of view are those who can best understand their opponent's point of view.
I have always found in those battles I described in the Pentagon, and I've been part of many of them, I've been on the winning end and the losing end of trying to make cases for the Navy and for resources for the Navy up against the sister services, if you will. I find you are exactly correct. The institution that can red team, can game it out, can understand, okay, what will the other side say? That is the side that will be most effective in a negotiation. See Roger Fisher, Getting to Yes, Negotiations, the classic book about how to be an effective negotiator, written, by the way, by a Harvard professor, but a pretty good one.
Did that apply in NATO, by the way?
Oh, immensely. And think about it for a moment. NATO, when I was the commander, Supreme Allied Commander, had 28 nations in it. Today it's 30. In order to walk in and carry the room, you have to understand what the Romanians think about a given issue, what the Icelanders think about it, how are the French going to react, who can be challenging within the halls of NATO, God bless them. What are the solid Germans thinking about this? If you don't understand what the other side is going to bring to the table, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty making the case that you want.
We have to talk about NATO next week. Tell us about 2034. I haven't seen this book behind you before, Admiral.
2034 comes out on the 9th of March, and it's my 10th book, Hugh, but it's my first novel. And I have co-written it with a wonderful, pure writer, novelist, but also an Afghan and Iraqi war hero named Elliot Ackerman. So the two of us came together to describe what a war with China would look like in the year 2034. We have written this not as a good guys, bad guys, U.S.-China kind of book, nor is it high-tech. It is a character-driven look at how these two nations could sleepwalk into a war. And again, no good guys, no bad guys. War is the bad guy. That's what we want to avoid. So we'll have a more fulsome conversation about that, I'm sure.
Oh, I've got to read it. I hope I get. Is there a Mr. Clark? I remember Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, Mr. Clark on the Iceland shore. Is there a Mr. Clark in there somewhere?
There are some fascinating characters, including an Iranian general, a Chinese naval attaché, an American deputy national security advisor, a woman commodore in command of a strike group in the South China Sea. It's a very rich, character-driven story. I think you'll
looking forward to 2034. Admiral Stav, thank you. Follow him at admiralstav.com or at Stavridis J on Twitter. And follow me, America, too. Relief Factor.